For those who are just joining us, Andrew Kirkland is the president of Justwealth, and we're talking RESPs because he's an expert because he has 3 kids. But before we get to chatting, Andrew, I want to go through some of the stats, which I found staggering. There's $70 billion in RESPs in this country. Last year alone, there was more than $5 billion that was added. And on average, the contribution is $1,657. So it's a substantial amount of money. And we'll talk about that later on, how much you should be contributing. But here's the flip side of it, because these things were set up a long time ago. My kids were eligible for RESPs. They're way more flexible than they used to be. But money comes out of those as well. Listen to these numbers. In 2020, there was $3.9 billion in withdrawals. There was 420,000 beneficiaries, 420,000 kids out there going to university or wherever they're going for their education are taking advantage of this, and their average withdrawal was $9,375. The numbers on the withdrawal are staggering. So let's start with the real basics, and folks, we invite you to send in questions. But let's start with the real basics. What is an RESP, and how much can you put in?
Yeah, so those numbers are quite large, and it makes a lot of sense if you dig into what an RESP can do for a child's education or a beneficiary education. So really, in the simplest terms, an RESP stands for Registered Education Savings Plan. And it's a tool that can be used to invest, or an account that can be invested in and tax sheltered for the use of post-secondary education funding. Okay. Along the way, within an RESP, and we'll always say RESP, that's just kind of the acronym that is used for that account type. But for an RESP, you get incentives by putting in money into that RESP. So the government wants to promote, I guess, further education of our children in Canada. So, giving some grants, giving some additional money to incentivize parents or grandparents or friends and families or aunts and uncles to open up an RESP for a beneficiary. They're willing to put in some money and have that money grow tax sheltered until the child ultimately goes to post-secondary education. But that's in the simplest terms.
But to be clear, though, it's not a tax deduction. You put the money in, you don't get a tax deduction as a result. You just put the money in, and the amount that grows is not taxable, right?
Right. Unlike an RSP, Registered Retirement Savings Plans, which any money you put in could be reduced from your income in that particular year. An RESP, Educational Savings Plan, is not like that. It just grows tax-free while it's invested in the RESP. And then when you withdraw the money, in a lot of cases, depending on how you withdraw it, but if you withdraw it for post-secondary education purposes, which most people hopefully do, it's actually taxed in the hands of the beneficiary or the student at that time. So from a tax perspective, it's most likely that child or student doesn't really have a high tax bracket because they're going to school. So the actual there'll be less taxes paid in the hands when you actually do take it out of the account as well.
Yeah, there's something else too called the Canadian Education Savings Grant that wasn't around when my kids were young, and I couldn't take advantage of it. So I'm not as well versed in what they are. What is a CESG?
Yeah, so again, another acronym, but it's a Canadian Education Savings Grant. And there's 3 main grants, if you will, that the federal government provide for RESP accounts. The first one, the first 2 actually that I'll talk about are kind of tied to actual contributions. So you have to make a contribution into an RESP in order to get the grant from the government. Now, the first one is the basic one, so everyone is eligible for it, and it's a 20% grant based on your contribution that you put in, okay? Up to $500 a year. So the government will say, if you put in X number of dollars, they'll give you $500 a year into the RESP.
Okay, let's be specific. If you put in $2,500, you'll get $500. But if you only put in $2,000, then it's $400.
Right. It's 20% of whatever you put in to a maximum of $500. I always like to describe it as this. So And you know, every year a beneficiary has what I call grant eligible contribution room. So a child born in 2021 this year, doesn't matter when in the year, could be in January or December, they have, that child, that beneficiary has $2,500 of grant eligible contribution room. So you put in $2,500, what the government will send, all the RESP providers will send that information off to the government and say, this particular account had $2,500 go into it, send us the grant proceeds. And they do. And it's usually a month in arrears. So any contributions made in November would come at the end of December to the RESP. But in you know, and I know this firsthand, but like if you have a child, you know, there's a lot of things that you're dealing with when your kids are growing. There's diapers, there's formula, there's a whole bunch of items that it doesn't really potentially allow a lot of young families to put in the money into their RESP and get the full maximizing of grant from year one, right? So what the government does allow you to do is they allow you to carry forward that grant or grant eligible contribution room to future years if you do not use it in any particular year. So as an example,
does it have to be registered though? Like, does it have to be enforced? Or can you say the kid's 3 years old and you say, hey, listen, I haven't made any contributions yet. So you've got that contribution room.
Yeah, you've got that contribution room. So it allows and flexibility for people that can't make contributions in the first year to still get that grant that they may have gotten if they made those contributions. But it's, you know, you can get it in future years. The only caveat to that is you can only catch up 1 year. So at a time. And really, it's an additional $2,500 you can contribute and get grants on. So I'll paint the picture like this. Say, for example, you had a child born in January of 2021. Okay. For 2021, you have $2,500 of grant eligible contribution room. Okay. If you did not do any type of contribution in 2021, come 2022, that means that you have $2,500 from 2022, along with the $2,500 from 2021 that you did not contribute. So you've got a total of $5,000 that you could put into an RESP and get grant on it. And again, it's 20% of that. So it's $1,000 on a $5,000 contribution that you could get.
Wow.
You can get grants on. Now,
you said that there were two
in any year. That's the maximum to get.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
But you said that there were two different kinds of free money from the federal government, right?
Yeah, there was. There is. So there's that basic one that we're describing. There's also an additional Canadian Education Savings Grant and what's called a Canadian Learning Bond. Those two, the additional and the Canadian Learning Bond, are tied to the family income. Okay, so the additional Canadian Education Savings Grant is either 10 or 20% on the first $500 of contribution in any year, depending on the income level of the family. But again, you've got to put the money in, and then it's 10 to 20% based on the income that you can get additional. With a Canadian Learning Bond, it is actually, you don't have to make a contribution to that one. It's just tied literally to the income of the family. So if a family had an income level that was potentially a little bit lower on the scale of the Canadian Learning Bond kind of metrics, you don't even have to make a contribution. You can literally open up an RESP, and then the government will give you $500 towards that RESP. And if you continue to qualify from an income level for 15 years, you get an additional $100 every single year. So, you know, those are some of the ways that they've incentivized people to make contributions. But also, if you can't afford contributions, just because the income level of the family doesn't necessarily enable you to do that, you still potentially have options to get money started in an RESP.
We're getting questions from the audience. At what age can you no longer contribute to an RESP?
Yeah, so you can no longer contribute and get grants for RESPs in the 18th year. So You can get grant every single year that we just talked about. All those continue to happen. Age 16 and age 17, there's certain restrictions as to making contributions into an RESP and getting grant on it. But then come after 18, you no longer can make contributions that would receive grant. You can still make contributions into an RESP if you want to have it still grow tax sheltered and then still have it taxed in the hands of the beneficiary. But from the grant purposes that we've talked about earlier, those no longer would apply after the 17th year.
Okay, but to be clear, the beneficiary is 16 or 17 or 18 years old as opposed to the contributor. You could be 100 years old and drop 50 grand into your grandkids if they were under 18 years of age, and you're good, right?
Yeah.
Is it, or am I right?
Yeah. So yeah, you're 100% right. It doesn't have to be. There's no limitations on the people or the person contributing into the RESP, and in fact, I think a lot of cases, grandparents want to open up RESPs for their grandchildren. They feel that this is a good gift, or maybe even this time of year, it's a good opportunity to make a contribution into an RESP account and open up an RESP account and having them as the subscriber, them as the contributor, but then having the beneficiary as the grandchild. And I think that goes to one of the other questions I see coming through here. It's coming through directly to me. It's talking about how important is an RESP successor subscriber. So we talked about potentially a grandparent or a parent being the actual subscriber or contributor to the account. But this one question was mentioning about what's called a successor subscriber, and that is basically if something was to happen to the subscriber, either the parent or the grandparent, who would take ownership or who would take authorization over that RESP. And the reason why it's important to do something like that is if, as a grandparent, you have an RESP set up for a grandchild and something happened to you, and the grandchild is not yet in post-secondary education, what happens to the plan at that time? And I think that can really be a sticky situation, because you either have to stipulate it in your will as to what you want this RESP, what do you want to have happen to it, or work with the provider that you're working with to name a successor subscriber, and hopefully they can allow that. Because if not, when the estates get settled, it will literally just work through the estate and go through the will, and may not necessarily be used towards post-secondary education for that beneficiary.
Now there's a twist.
Yeah.
So I may be 80 years old. I contribute to my grandkids, and I'm putting in, the maximum grant eligible amount of $2,500 a year. That could be a substantial amount of money, but it's not the kids' money.
Right. It's not. So the money actually is the subscriber's money. So whoever is the contributor, whoever is named on the account, it's their money. They've put it in, but it's being used for the purposes of funding post-secondary education. So when the money comes out, you have to provide a proof of enrollment for the child, and then the grants and all that can go out to fund the post-secondary education. But yeah, it's really important to look at this from an overall estate planning perspective. And sometimes people just neglect, or they don't really think about from an RESP. It's like, okay, that they just assume that RESP will go towards the beneficiary and everything will be fine on their passing. But that may not necessarily be the case. And it's also important, one, to make sure you name these things. You can also name like joint subscribers, so a husband and wife or a mother and father could be a joint subscriber, so it can roll over to the other person if something was to happen. So that's a good one. But also when you're naming, say for example, a successor subscriber, or information in your will as to what you would like to have happen with this RESP, just make sure whoever you're naming as that new subscriber has an interest in the beneficiaries keeping that grant and having the proceeds go to their education. Because in that case, it will become their money. And if they wanted to take the money out, they could, and then potentially the grant goes back to the government, and then there's nothing left for the post-secondary education purposes.
Wow. Okay, I'm going to paint a scenario for you and walk me through how this works, because I'm a parent and I want to contribute to my kids' education, and I'm a grandparent and I want to contribute to the same child's education. So the parent puts in $1,000, we'll say, and the grandparent puts in $1,500. Are they both put into the same plan? Because, you know, the grandparent eventually will die, and that becomes part of their estate. But what part is theirs, and what part is the parents?
Yeah. So in this scenario you've talked about here, you can have two RESPs, and the grandparents is the subscriber of one, the parents is the subscriber of the other one, right?
Oh,
so
okay.
That can definitely happen, and you know, I think it's depending on the institution. Some institutions may allow the grandparent to put money directly into the parent's RESP for the beneficiary, whereas others, you can't do that. So they have to, if the grandparents want to make a contribution towards an RESP for their grandchild, they either have to open it themselves or send the money to the parent through some form, a check or whatever the case, and then the parent sends the money into the RESP that's been established. Now, so there are options, but a lot of cases people do it separately and have a grandparent RESP or a parent RESP, and then they're all kind of, you know, they're on their own devices of making contributions. Now, I will say that though, there's not a doubling up of the grant proceeds. So the government keeps track of the grant proceeds that they're paying out. So the grant, you know, the grandparent RESP will get their grant, and the parent will get their grant up to that maximum of $2,500 for that beneficiary. Right, so you can't double up on that stuff, but they are keeping track of all that.
Okay, so now the money's in the. We've walked through some of the tax scenarios, and folks, if you have questions about the tax scenarios, please send them in, and I'm certain Andrew, you take emails or something like that, wouldn't you?
Sure, 100%.
Okay, yeah. But how should you invest? You know, in an RESP. What style of investment should you use? Should you shoot for the stars, or should you look for regular income, or what?
Yeah, it's a great question, and you know, a lot of it can be dependent on the risk appetite of that subscriber and maybe what they're willing to take on from a risk perspective. But you know, our approach at Justwealth is, you know, a very process driven. You know, keeping your fees low, keeping the costs low, investing in exchange traded funds. But we have a pretty unique product when it comes to RESPs, and we call it an education target date portfolio. So as an example, someone born in 2021, what we do is we look at, okay, when are they expected? When is their estimated post-secondary enrollment year, right? And so that would be 18 years from now. So we have a portfolio that would get more conservative as you get closer to that post-secondary education enrollment date. So 18 years from now, 2039. And right now, because you have 18 years on your side, we believe that you have the ability to take on more risk within your portfolio. So you'll have more of an equity tilt. You'll have more exposure to the stock market. But as you get closer to that particular year, you'll get more focused on fixed income and more focused on conserving the assets. So if something like COVID happens, or if there's a pullback in the markets, you're insulated from that as you get closer to that time frame. And you know, you don't want to necessarily be all risk when you're taking the money out in maybe a year or two, right? That's the exact opposite of what you want to do. So so yeah, that's kind of how we focus on that. But we have one for every single year of a birth year. So, you know, we have a 2022 portfolio, 2023, 2024, and each one of those are tied to that birth year 18 years prior.
There was a question that flashed up from the audience as well about education. What qualifies as education? Is it always university? Is it college? Is it trade school? Could it even be a private school? at the high school level?
Yeah. So, and the education savings, the ESDC from Canada, they publish a list of qualifying post-secondary education. But yes, it could be university, college, trade school. I know in Quebec they have CEGAP, which starts for grade 11 and 12. Those can qualify as well. But they keep a list of all those education institutions, and I think they're potentially adding and adding new schools that may be qualified, but trade schools would be one of them. But you'd want to check that for sure. When you're looking to take the money out, and if that would qualify.
Okay, so then the corollary is, what if the child, the beneficiary, is, you keep using that technical term, as the beneficiary, doesn't go to school? It just says, I give up. I'm not going to do that. What can happen to the money?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and we get that one quite often. It's a very popular question because you don't really know. It's you open up an RESP with the best intentions of 18 years from now they're going to be going off to a post-secondary education, but you really don't know, and in some cases they just don't. Right? They've got another passion, they do something else, and they just don't go to school. So in that case, what happens is you can get your money back. You can get the money out of the RESP out. Any contributions that go into it, you can take out, and you don't really have any penalties on that. There's no tax unless your contributions. However, any withdrawals that occur that are not for post-secondary education purposes, any grant tied to that will be sent back to the government. So that goes back to the government. It's really incentivizing people to provide incentives and provide additional funding for attending post-secondary education. So that's the contributions. The grants go back, and there's also the growth proceeds, because assuming you invest it and it's vested for a long time, hopefully you make money. The growth in the account can be, there's certain restrictions that have to be met, but that can be transferred, either taken in cash as a withdrawal. There would be tax on it. Or if you have contribution room in your RSP, that growth portion can be moved over, can be transferred to your RSP if you have the room, and that can continue to grow tax-free at that point.
Really? There's a question that got kind of cut off, and it has to do with the Canada Student Financial Assistance Act. Do we know what that is? I don't know what the question was, to be honest.
Designated under the Canada Student Assistance Act, what mentioned counts? I'm not.
Maybe that's in reference to the schools you're talking about.
Yeah, there's reference to the school.
Okay.
There was a question about, like, what if they delay post-secondary education, say 30 years old, any penalties? So no, an RESP can stay in existence for 35 years. So if your child, say for example, doesn't go to school at the age of 18 or 21, you don't have to do anything with it. You can still keep it intact, and maybe they'll go to post-secondary education at some time in the future, and at that time they could use all the proceeds, the grants and the growth and all that, and you don't have to worry about it. So there's no penalties, but after a certain time, you'll have to 35 years, you'll have to do something with it. So the penalties at that time would be payments of the grant back, because you didn't use it for post-secondary education. But again, you get your contributions, and the growth proceeds could be either taken out or transferred to an RSP.
Okay, we've been talking about this for almost half an hour, not quite. And it seems to me it's a lot of acronyms: RESP, CESG, CLB. Where can people go to kind of figure it out?
Yeah, no, there is a lot. And honestly, like, as a parent and 3 young kids, sometimes the financial industry makes these things harder than it has to be to understand.
Yeah.
And I think, if you're in the industry or you're very knowledgeable on this and you follow this stuff, you're going to get it. But a lot of people they're just not going to pay attention to that, especially these times of the year. So they just put it off, right? And I think, there's a lot of opportunity for people to just make contributions into an RESP. It doesn't even have to be much. It could start out with, you know, $50 a month, and you get grant on that, and it can add up significant over a period of time. So what we're trying to do is literally make it so easy for people that they don't have to worry about any of this. All these forms, there's a lot of forms. We automate it, we digitize it. It makes it extremely simple for somebody to set up an account. But when it comes to the actual, if you want to learn about how an RESP works, we have a very informative guide. It's called the Justwealth Guide to Education Savings Plan, that gives some frequently asked questions about some of the things that we've talked about tonight, and along with more information about our target date portfolios and how they work. But you know, that's a great resource. The Canadian government does have a very long list of resources on RESPs. But you know, so you can obviously tap into that resource, and we're obviously here for people too to help out and answer any questions. And some of the longest conversations, the most in-depth conversations we have with people are people who are setting up RESPs for their children. And I find that a lot of times people, when they set up these accounts, they care more about the RESP than they do their own RSP or tax-free savings account. They really
well, it's the grandkids,
right.
They're involved, right?
Exactly. So it's I totally get it. It's a busy time for people, but it's just what we're trying to do right now is making it as easy as possible and help people get access to this government money as much as they can. So going to justwealth.com/RESP, there's our guide there. There's more information that can be found there, and you can literally set up your RESP account and sign all the paperwork right within our portal.
You know, you mentioned something we haven't touched on. All this has to be done by the end of the year, doesn't it? In order to qualify for the grants, isn't there a deadline?
Yeah, so there is a deadline. Like it's a calendar year type of grant. So you want to put the money in to get your 2021 grants by the end of the year. Now, having said that, if you don't, again, there's that carry forward feature that if you don't make a contribution in 2021, you can always, kind of put that into 2022. But the more years you push it back, the less money is going to be in the account, because you can only, and get grants on potentially, because you can only put in that maximum a year. It's the $5,000 that you can put in to get grant on it. You could put in 6,000 or 7,000 or 8,000. You can put in 50. Those are a lifetime contribution limit that you could put in $50,000, and you could put it in the day that the child's born. You need a SIN to open up an RESP, but you could do it the first year and you'd only get grant on 2,500 of it and get $500, but that may be better. But if you're not putting the money in right now, and your main objective is to maximize the grants, each year you push it out, you're kind of limiting how much you can actually put in. But look, I see another.
Okay, so tell me your personal experience. You got 3 kids?
Yeah.
Do you have 3 RESPs, or do you just have one and then you will dole it out as the kids go to school?
Yeah. So I got a little bit different situation, but I have a couple RESPs. A lot of cases, what happens is people set up what's called a family RESP, and there was a question here that talked about, like, can any child in the family use the money? And the answer to that is yes. And it's all about, when you set up an RESP, there's really two main decisions you have to look on. You need to, one, be like, okay, who's going to be the subscriber? So parent, mom, dad, or just mom or just dad. So you have to decide on that. And the second aspect is, what type of RESP is it? Is it a family plan or is it an individual plan? A family plan is when multiple beneficiaries in the same bloodline, brothers and sisters, can be named to the family plan. If it's just individual, it's just one beneficiary. That's pretty simple. But most times what happens, and we recommend this to all our clients, is to open up a family RESP. Even if you have one child, open up a family RESP. Maybe there's going to be additional children that would be named to the account in the future. But say, for example, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, talking about if a child doesn't go to school. If a child doesn't go to school in a family RESP, the other beneficiaries can use the proceeds that have been built up in the RESP, right? So, there's two main things: the subscribers, joint or individual, and then a family or individual plan. So, anyways, it's there's a lot of ways you can set it up, but it makes it complicated, but it doesn't need to be complicated. We help a lot of clients out. And I think a lot of the times it's a great incentive to get people saving and force saving, putting in that $50 a month, or if you want to maximize $2,500 a year, you put in $208 every single month and you get the maximum grant. But it doesn't have to be complicated. It can be an easy account, and it can be very beneficial as you grow tax sheltered over a 18-year time frame.
We've ran out of time. We had a lot of great questions, so thank you so much for the questions to the audience. And Andrew, thank you for your time today and explaining all that.
Yeah, no, it was a pleasure, and there is a lot of information here. So now that we've done this once, Pat, I think we got it down. So maybe we come back in the future and dig a little bit deeper about RESPs. So. And
again, apologies to people that tuned in yesterday. We were having technical difficulties, weren't we, Andrew?
Sure,
just a little bit.
But we're good now. So.
Well, have a great night.
Yeah, thanks, Pat. Thanks, everyone, for joining. It was a pleasure.
Andrew Kirkland, President, Justwealth Financial.